and welcome to Roundtable with me, David Foster. Food in Syria now costs 20 times what it did before the civil war, and even bread is getting hard to come by. People may well have endured almost 10 years of conflict, but will this and increasing economic hardship put extra pressure on the Assad regime? Well, even though the Syrian government's won back control of most of the country, just how tight is President Assad's hold on power? The Syrian pound's weakness is making it hard for the country to buy wheat. There are new US sanctions, and with more and more people going hungry, the calls for change are getting louder.
This month, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad marks 20 years in power. For almost half that time, Syria has been at war. Thanks to a brutal crackdown and support from international backers, mainly Russia and Iran, Assad has taken back control of around 70% of Syria. But now he's battling a new crisis, an economic one. Food prices increased to 20 times their pre-war levels. The value of the Syrian lira has plummeted, and UN agencies say 9.3 million people, over half the population, are food insecure. In recent months, rare protests erupted in regime-held cities such as Sweden, where some even called for the removal of the Assad regime. The most punitive US sanctions on Syria, the Caesar Act, are increasing pressure on the government. A parallel economic crisis in Lebanon has added to Syria's woes, as the regime holds most of its assets in Lebanese banks. And it's exposed divisions within the Assad family. The president moved to seize the assets of his cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who had bankrolled the crackdown on Syria's protesters. It all adds up to more suffering for the Syrian people, but will it affect the regime?
Let us welcome in London Ibrahim Olabi, lawyer at the London-based Guernica 37 Chambers and founder of the Syrian Legal Development Programme. In Barcelona, Rahaf al Doughli, lecturer in Middle East politics at Lancaster University. And back to London, where we see Sami Hamdi, editor-in-chief of the International Interest. Ibrahim, let me come to you first of all. After almost 10 years of civil war, these have been very difficult times for many, many Syrians. But how much tougher are they now with the economy in the state it is?
Thank you. Much tougher. The situation is very difficult for Syrians all over Syria. And it's important when we talk about Syrians to remember that Syria is no longer a one Syria. It might be that in kind of its legal borders, but the de facto situation is that the situation of the Northwest is different to that of the Northeast. To those in government-controlled areas. And when we're talking about government-controlled areas, or when we talk about the economy, the reference is usually made to those areas because that's where the biggest collapse has happened. That's where the dependency on the Syrian pound, the lira, is huge, and that's what made news recently. And so, yes, for the ordinary Syrian, the situation has become much worse with the purchasing power of the pound dropping, with things becoming more expensive, with less access. But it's easy in situations like these to, just blame the unknown or blame, Western actors for what's happening. But it's always important to keep that in context, that what happened in Syria and what the economic situation that Syrians are suffering from is to the most extent blamed on the regime and its actions and the money that it has spent fueling the war crime economy and what happened in Lebanon, the corruption, the bribery, and all of that. So yes, they're suffering, but the why is what needs to be focused on.
Okay, well, we'll get on to Lebanon in just a moment. I'm sure of that because of the ties between the two countries. But Sami, let me ask you this one. Those people who are suffering the most now, are they a very different group of people, if you like, to those who first protested back in 2010, 2011, students to begin with? Are they those who would be able perhaps to put more pressure on the authorities if they felt it was in their interest to do so?
I think given the destruction that's taking place in the war, I think those who are protesting don't want anything of the sort to come anywhere near them. So I think the protest against Assad, I think the demands that they will make will be limited. The extent of the action that they would be willing to go to will be limited, because it does appear, anybody looking at the war, that Assad is going to stay. We heard even Ibrahim Kalin in Doha saying that the idea of Bashar Assad staying, being a red line, is no longer on the table. So there is this international consensus that Assad may well be here to stay. And that's important in this context, because it shows that despite the fact that there are protests, despite the fact that there is a declining economy, these are people who perhaps were insulated from the destruction of the war for an extensive period, given that it moved away from Damascus after 2013, after 2014. They're beginning to feel the pinch, however.
Yeah, Sami, but if people are becoming restive, are they not the type of people who could increase some pressure on Assad?
I think they could increase the pressure on Assad, but I think the fact that they're protesting now, even though there have been like spatters of protest over the number of years, the fact that they're protesting now suggests that there may be solutions that Assad could offer them to keep the peace, that their interests are not necessarily in this idea that everybody else in Syria is talking about the need to bring down Bashar al-Assad. Their needs are economical, so Assad will look to find some way to appease them, some way to deal with this economic crisis, whether that be leaning on Iran, it may well be leaning on Russia, although Russia doesn't often give money, or even leaning on the likes of Turkey, as a rapprochement looks increasingly on the cards. So I think when we're looking at these particular protests, I think we should look at them within the economic case and not necessarily within the political case.
Okay, well, that's a fair point. But the economic case affects the ordinary people in terms of their food shortages, perhaps. This is what Mike Robson from the FAO, that's the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, he's the Syria rep, he said there is already some evidence of people cutting out meals. If the currency continues under pressure, imports will be difficult to obtain, and the months leading up to the 2021 wheat harvest may see real shortages. Rahaf, what is that going to mean to the people of Syria and ultimately perhaps to Assad's hold on power?
There are two things at stake here when it comes to the economic crisis. I think Assad has survived this war for the last 10 years, not because only of the external alliance or even he can survive this current economic crisis based, because the basis of legitimacy that the regime is kind of relying on is the ideological legitimacy. And as just Ibrahim mentioned, that there is always the regime can survive this kind of struggles and challenges by using the external threat, the kind of the enemy outside. So by the economic crisis can be challenged and survived because the regime is being very much, trained to co-opt warlords and also to approach, these warlords, and even he can use different brokers, and he can even buy what he needs to appease the people, the ordinary people inside. When it comes to the protest that is just swept different in Sueda specifically, and I think the Sueda protest really marks an important point where the regime could have been really challenged and failed. However, when it becomes very politicized, it was very much easy for the regime to legitimize the use of violence. So if these protests were very much limited in terms of asking for their economical needs rather than calling for the regime to step down, then I think that that could be a kind of a chance or a window to weaken the regime.
Yeah. So, okay. I see what you're saying there. I want to go back to Ibrahim to cover some of the areas you mentioned with Lebanon. A lot of money that is tied to the powerful, to the elite in Syria, is and has been tied up in Lebanese banks. A lot of money flowing between the two countries. Now the Lebanese economy is in the most awful state, controls over who can and cannot get money out, and the flow of finance is strictly limited. Does he not, no, let's not just say he, do not the powerful people of Syria need to have access to their money to fulfill any promises that they're going to have to make?
Absolutely, and I think Lebanon has played a key role in this. And Syria has been sanctioned for a long time. It was sanctioned since the Hariri Tribunal. It was sanctioned in 2008. Rali Makhlouf was sanctioned in 2008. Then we got the 2011 sanctions. Then we got 4 or 5 executive orders between 2011 up until now. And then you've got Caesar recently. But if you've seen throughout all these sanctions, the proper weakness or the weakening of the economy and the currency did not happen when the sanctions were imposed. It happened when Lebanon started crashing economically. That is because the one way of sanction evasion is the fronting, the using of offshore or neighboring countries' banking systems, which the regime relied on. And Lebanon knows that. In the Brussels conference just a couple of weeks ago, the president of the Council of Ministers said clearly that any sanctions that affect Syria should not affect Lebanon, and because they know that there are links between Lebanon, there are corporate links, there are financial links, there are transfer of currency links, there is exchange offices that are based in Lebanon that are kind of assisting or have been assisting Assad and its regime in surviving across these sanctions. And that there aren't so many other kind of regional easy access country that you can transfer money between Beirut and Damascus with your diplomatic car with hundreds of thousands of dollars, which are things that used to happen.
So if Lebanon is weak, which it is, and it has relied so much on Syria in the past, if Lebanon is weak and now the Syrian elite are relying on getting their money out and they can't get it out, what about this from Serhat Erkman? I'll come to you, Sami, if I may. Political analyst on Syria. He said, while Assad feels he's close to the eventual victory in the civil war, he could bitterly discover that he might not have the economic power, which is the most essential means to control the rest of the country. He has to sort this out if he's going to have any real legitimacy among the people who would benefit, if you like, from him being in power, but may suffer if they haven't got the money. Suffer is a relative term there.
I think on that particular point, let's zoom out a little bit. Before the Caesar Act and before Lebanon's collapse, the UAE were ready to put up funds to help rebuild Syria. Turkey's approach to Assad being a red line was changing. Iran was liaising very closely with Assad, and Russia was holding a new round of Astana talks, which brought about further cooperation, even a rapprochement between Turkey and Iran, who had been heavily at odds. In other words, everything was going towards this idea that Assad was winning the war and he might actually find the means, find the money to rebuild Syria, because the UAE, Saudi, these countries want to compete to try to bring Syria back into the Arab fold. So I think the idea that Assad's reliance on Lebanon is his only reliance, is his only source of income, I think that's not entirely the picture. The biggest obstacle now to Assad with regards to his economy and his finances is the US. Assad is being targeted not because he is Assad, not because the US suddenly believes in the revolution, not because the US suddenly believes that Assad needs to go. The Caesar Act comes about and the pressure on Assad comes about as a result of this renewed push against Iran. Assad will feel that he's being swept up in the wider US-Iran conflict. And this has significant ramifications for how Assad is going to act with regards to the chaos in Lebanon, with regards to access to finances and access to the economy. Because what Assad will be trying to do, he's going to be considering, is staying with Iran worth all of this pressure that's coming in when the UAE were about to invest billions in my economy?
What will his decision be, do you think?
I think he will stick to Iran because he needs the Iranian troops on the ground in order to help him cement his authority and cement his ties. He will try to pressure Russia, try to pressure Iran to find some ways to funnel money through other means. He may well try a rapprochement with Turkey in a bid that Turkey, which is balancing between Russia and the US, might turn a blind eye to some facilities that might go towards Syria. Assad has options, even if they are very difficult options. If Assad goes, who is the alternative? That's the problem that the Syrian people who are protesting have. If you kick Assad out, the family is still there, they're still controlling the institutions, and the opposition are in Idlib and in other areas of Syria, incapable of coming and mounting a successful resistance.
Sami, that sort of leads me to the next section of the program, which is about if Assad remains in power, what kind of power base does he have among the ruling elite? And there's Rami Makhlouf, his cousin, said to be the richest man in Syria, or certainly was, owning between 60 and 80% of the economy. Now, Assad, and I'll come to you on this one if I may, Rahaf. Rami Makhlouf has put out a series of videos. He's now under house arrest. He's put out a series of videos saying, yes, he's still loyal to Assad, but the sense is that President Assad's wife has been given the job of sidelining Rami Makhlouf. And we'll talk about that when we come back from listening to one little clip of Mr. Makhlouf in his villa.
يا سيادة رئيس الأجهزة الأمنية بلشت تتعدى على حريات الناس. هدول ناسك، هدول موالين، هدول كانوا معك وما زالوا معك.
And that was all about his workers, he said, being sacked, his managers being sidelined, security forces getting involved in his business. And the suggestion has been that Asmar al-Assad, the president's wife, has been given the job, as I said, of trying to take him out of the picture. Are there family feuds, you think, that could destabilize President Assad?
I think this current or this recent, family rift between Rami Makhlouf and Assad kind of bring back the many misconceptions about the robustness of authoritarianism in Syria. That Assad is surviving because that his family or the Alawites are backing him up, and then we are seeing that Assad is actually attacking one of his family members, an Alawite businessman. And then it kind of brings to the fore that the survival of the regime is not because of certain sectarian alliances, but an ideological one that the regime has been mobilizing and cultivating for the last not only 10 years, but 4 decades. I think with the Rami Makhlouf example, or the recent kind of rift, it kind of blazed on the side of Assad and his survival, because he can use this kind of logic or narrative that, look, I am attacking my own, one of my own family, and it's not about sectarian alliances, but more about that I am, because he was seeing that the economic crisis is coming with the Caesar Act. So he was trying to play this plan before having the implementation of the Caesar Act. So to say to the people, to sell this kind of argument that, look, I am on your side, I'm trying to fight or to try to fight.
Okay, I sort of get that.
Corruption.
We should point out, because it's been referred to so many times, Caesar Act, the latest round of US sanctions, I think named after a Syrian photographer who took pictures of many of the brutality or brutal things that had happened during the Syrian war. Ibrahim, let me ask you, do you agree with Rafat here that he's doing this perhaps to show that he is part of the people, that his crowd aren't necessarily the ones who are taking advantage? Or is he doing it because he feels that Rami Makhlouf and others of that ilk are a threat to him?
I mean, everyone, once you run a dictatorship like Syria, you become so insecure that at any moment, you're afraid that this person might, turn around against you. And I think there are multiple reasons why this happened. And I think part of it is economical, but it's also to send a message that, we need this kind of support, and I will not be supporting people who are not paying their bills, at least retrospectively. So I think that with the Rami kind of example, he also set an example for other business men, that if you don't pay your quote unquote bills, that this is you will be targeted. But if I may, David, I want to just quickly comment on what your guest has said on a number of quick issues, and I think it's quite important to remember that when Syrians took it to the streets, they took it to the streets in order to not know who the alternative is right away. That's how democracy works, right? People, you present the opportunity, and whoever wants to run can run. And I think this is what the West has been saying, and what Russia's been saying, and what Iran's been saying as to, well, who is the alternative? When the opportunity presents itself, there are a lot of other capable Syrians who will most probably will try to do kind of assume public office. And I really don't think it's in Assad's hand to control, his fate. He's playing a dangerous game between Russia and Iran and their allies, and even the UAE and others were singled out by Jeffrey and Rayburn, the two ambassadors or envoys to Syria, as to they should not engage with the regime and so on. And so I really do not. The question here becomes, will the cost that the sanctions are imposing on the regime be, or the benefit of supporting the regime for Russia and Iran outweigh the cost that the US is presenting? And at the moment, there is a cost, and the higher it becomes, the more willing they might be willing to kind of let go of Assad. And I think 2021 elections presents that opportunity, which links us to how businessmen like Rami are involved, because in the kind of elections, and we've seen that in the parliamentary elections, we had a huge number of Syrian businessmen run for the parliamentary elections and win, and they're also seen as an actor that is pragmatic, that might be able to kind of solve both the political and economic crisis. And that's where the US and EU sanctions are playing a leverage as to who they sanction and who they don't for a potential 2021
Okay, so
election.
let me ask this to Sami, if I may. Is Assad himself and his elite, or the elite he surrounds himself with, the real problem here in trying to come up with a solution, or is it far more deeply ingrained than that? And if he's going to be there for the long term, what happens to Syria?
I think the issue is that where the Russians might have contemplated replacing Assad, they believe it's too costly to replace Assad. Moreover, the Iranians have no intention of replacing Assad. If we're looking at Iranian foreign policy in the region, they are a very, very loyal ally. They back the Houthis, they back the militias in Iraq, they backed Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. Even under sanctions, they're willing to spend to protect those allies. And Iran, which has had an extensive relationship with the Assad family, is not about to abandon Bashar now. So for the Russians, as much as we paint Russia as an overlord, and it is to some extent, Russia is not going to try to abandon Assad, because Iran will try to fill in the gap, and Iran is ready to go toe-to-toe with the Russians in Syria, because it needs to protect this bridge that it's trying to establish towards Lebanon. The US factor is a new factor. It's a re-emergent after the US sort of sat on the sidelines for a while. But this doesn't mean the US has a strategy. It doesn't mean the US knows what it wants to do. It doesn't mean the US has a plan as to what happens if Assad goes or he doesn't go. The US may believe Assad won't even go by the Caesar Act, and this is more about containing Iran, which is
okay.
Why
So and anyway, we're going to have to wait until we see what happens in November, most likely, to see where the US stands on this. Rahaf, we're coming towards the end of the program, unfortunately. I found it fascinating, but I wanted just to end with this thought. Is it extraordinary that at a time when Bashar al-Assad seems to be at his strongest in terms of winning the war in Syria, there are those who are suggesting, and rumors circulating, that he could actually be at his weakest position?
I don't think he's in his. Saying these kind of strong. I'm very critical of saying strongest, weakest, or even winning the war. He has not won the war. He has survived somehow. He has used many techniques to survive the war. Maybe he will be especially in Soviet type regimes. They can actually challenge the economic crisis if they maintain their ideological legitimacy. He can survive this economic crisis if he relied on actually annihilating the other when they oppose him. So I think that we can make him in his weakest points when we step back from this binary loyal non-loyalist, and we kind of adapt our narrative. The revolutionaries adapt their narrative and rethink our especially reflecting on the last 10 years and how we can challenge him in new ways and new techniques.
Yes. Ibrahim, the consensus seems to be that he isn't going anywhere very fast, and that has been the case for the last 9, maybe 10 years. And more Syrians are going hungry. It's a desperate situation still.
Absolutely, and you know the problem is the West hasn't got a strategy. You know, we always tell them that sanctions are a policy tool, not the policy. You can't just sit back and sanction a country that has never led to any sort of democratic change. And there are so many players that are involved in Syria that I personally believe that no one has the solution. It's not the Americans, it's not the Turks, it's not definitely not the Syrians, and not the Iranians or the Russians. But that also breeds you know, it gives a gap for opportunity. That kind of chaos might also you know, lead to some sort of change. I mean, I think this period between now and November is crucial to see, you know, how much this administration is able to push forward, and they have been. We've seen that their ambassadors become incredibly active in the last period. But if not, and Assad is there for the long run, there is a much bigger battle, because he could even for himself, because he could no longer justify the economic situation based on an enemy. You know, there is no longer an ongoing conflict. There is a frozen conflict in Syria, and he's not with Israel. So
I'm terribly sorry. I'm sorry, but there we have to leave it. And look, we'll return to it again. And if you say the next 6 months are crucial, we will keep our eye on what's going and maybe invite you back. Thank you very much for taking your time today. Ibrahim, Rahaf, and Sami, thank you for your time watching this program. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team. Goodbye for now.